When I started to seriously design a studio, this coincided with the post-war appearance of an enormous amount of junk from the Army, Navy, and Air Force. So for someone who knew what to do and could handle a soldering iron and could design audio equipment, even if you only had 30 shillings in your pocket, you could get something. And so I was able to get started on my electronic experiments.
At this point in London's history, high modernity, London is being rebuilt after the Second World War. And I think you can think of people like Tristram Carey as dreaming of a future soundscape of London.
If you want a very quick and not very complete definition, music is sound which has been organized. At any period, a composer tends to use his resources. Nowadays, we have all the resources of recording and artificially produced sound of various kinds, and the composers are using it.
Very often, I would come to a point of working on something where I wanted to say, peace. Electronic music seemed to have no limits. You get right away from saying, this is in the key of E flat, you know. You can use any pitch you like. You don't talk about C, you talk about a frequency. We all dreamt about in the early days that it was a music sans frontières. It had no boundaries. Instrumental music has unfortunately boundaries by the pitch of the instrument, you know. The piano will only go
Dalek story in 1963. It was totally uncompromising.
They are approaching.
Electronic music was seen in Britain in this period, you know, the late 60s, as a totally weird thing. People would be exposed to it through shows like Doctor Who, but I think to make the transition to this being a form of entertainment that's kind of enjoyable, that was a huge leap.
You haven't lived.
Music in that context, it kind of fits in. You know, here was the science and technology of music being pushed to the next level.
I don't know quite how I came into electronic music itself. Cockrell.
A friend of mine gave me a crystal set, and that started me on electronics, putting aerials out of the window, risking death by lightning.
Peter had some technical ability, but David Cockrell, as Peter would describe him, was his kind of electronic genius.
I would say it's a mad idea. Can we have this? I want this. And he would produce it. He would understand exactly what my pathetic way of putting something was. He would be able to interpret it into a concrete electronic idea and make the bloody thing. And it worked. And very soon he realized that what we needed, the ultimate sequencer, was not going to be something which he could build or another engineer could build, but would be quite simply a digital computer.
Well, a PDP-8 mini computer was the first, well, it was the first cheap computer, but cheap at that time was £5,000, which was not at all cheap in terms, well, it was as much as a house.
I was lucky in those days to have a rich wife, and so we sold her tiara and we swapped it for a computer. And this was the first computer in the world in a private house.
Putney, where Peter Zinoviev has a hobby which is strictly for boffins. He keeps it in his garden shed, and it's called Digital PDP 8/S. Yes, it's a computer, and it has a hobby too, composing music. Peter helps with the ideas, but the actual performance is all Digital's work.
And digital computers were already used in process control in factories. That's exactly what we wanted. We wanted to process control for different sounds so that one would follow another or a combination of them would be heard together.
He wanted to make, well, innovative music, sounds that nobody had made before.
Peter Zinoviev was was using computers in a way that would become commonplace in the mid-80s. He was doing almost 20 years earlier with equipment that was large and unwieldy, not designed for the purpose. And he and his co-engineers were developing things that had never been even considered up to that point, let alone considered possible.
Many of the things that Peter did were really quite advanced, and one of them was sampling. He made the first sampler that I know of anywhere in the world.
The trouble with sampling is that to get a sound which sounds the same as what you put in requires a huge lot of information.
So the whole of his computer's memory, which was about 8,000 characters, was occupied with storing this little fragment of sound.
It was at the cutting edge, and neither the people who came nor ourselves knew what we could do with this apparatus.
I remember once Karl-Heinz Stockhausen came, and they collaborated for quite a while and spent a long time making a box the size of a fridge, which was insulated from a sound point of view, so that they could record the sound of a fly screaming.
Also, it was very lonely. I had no idea that there was anybody else in Britain doing it at all, nobody. Then I discovered that Tristram, who'd been doing it for much longer than I had, and that was a great revelation. He was very well known. He'd done lots of film music, and we formed this new company, EMS.
When I got together with Zinoviev and Cockerell towards the end of the 60s, one of the decisions made was that there wasn't enough electronic concert music going on in England.
A few miles down the Thames at the Queen Elizabeth Hall, the first concert in Britain given by a computer.
The next item, Partita for Unattended Computer by Peter Zinoviev, is a true live performance in the sense that no magnetic tape is being used at all. Furthermore, the computer has a choice at various stages in the procedure, and the piece therefore comes out different every time it's played. The performance you're about to hear is therefore unique and unrepeatable. First of all, checks are made to see that the composition is correctly loaded into the computer. The computer is started and will carry out the performance unattended.
The audience is a capacity one, but the computer's performance didn't meet with universal approval. The Financial Times said, technically, it may be a triumph of skill and knowledge, but what we heard resembled the dreariest kind of neo-Webern drawn out to inordinate length.
What we were making was very, very simple sounds. It's things like that. On the other hand, if you were a technician, you'd realize that into those simple sounds had gone a huge amount of effort. The computer was actually controlling sound equipment, the sound equipment was controlling an amplifier, and out it came all by itself. This was incredible technology for those days.
And I've got the reviews, some of which were a bit scathing, you know, and some of them were saying, well, it's an interesting noise, but it's not music.
Oh, the whole purpose of EMS was to pay for Peter's computer studio. That was his first love. He thought he could pay for it by making miniature versions of the things he had in his studio that could be sold.
And I thought that perhaps we could all work together and make something which was very profitable.
We were approached by the Australian composer, Don Banks.
He was an avant-garde composer who wanted an electronic box of tricks.
And I built the box, and David filled it up with electronics.
And the VCS3 was the first synthesizer in Europe.
So it's very, very rare for a whole new class of instruments to come along, and that's what the synthesizer is. So in that extent, I think it's one of the pivotal moments in 20th century musical instrument history, the invention of the synthesizer. It's happening, it's been invented in America by Bob Moog, but Peter Zinoviev and Tristram Carey and David Cockrell have a unique part of this by building the VCS3, one of the very first synthesizers.
The whole thing of it spinning off into, you know, progressive rock, experimental rock music, I think that was just a complete coincidence.
Aspiring rock musicians, experimental people who never dreamed that they could own a synthesizer, suddenly it's within their price range. They can afford this piece of equipment. Well, one of the kind of unique London bands who bought a VCS3 synthesizer was a band called Hawkwind, started by Dave Brock, who was a busker. And Hawkwind had this incredible psychedelic space sound.
I mean, what we were doing very basic riffs, you know, that used to go dun dun dun. Sorry, we used to practice on audiences, because what we're talking about is using these, you can actually get similar earthquake velocity, real bottom end, going for a big PA, the whole thing's. Consequently, we're talking about sounds of the spheres, working with sort of colours of light. So you know what you're doing is actually our, I suppose, perspective was to take people on trips without taking LSD.
Some of these musicians would actually be tripping when they first encountered the synthesizer. And I think that what was happening to these musicians is that it was, you know, part of the 60s classic thing for, you know, expanding your consciousness. And here was this wonderful new instrument that could almost take you on this magical trip. And you never knew quite for sure what you were going to get out of this instrument. It was very capricious. You'd mess around with it. Some of the sounds were horrible. Could be a bad trip, and some of the sounds would just sort of be heavenly and would be just beautiful and take you away. And I think the performers of the synthesizer, they described the VCS3 in particular, which had an incredible range of sounds, as like acid, sort of like an electronic form of the drug acid.
They'd feel the same thing as what we did. So, yeah, that's what we used to do in the early days. Obviously, as you get older, you stop taking it, of course, I might add, you know.
Because we had very, very revolutionary equipment and a very revolutionary studio, we attracted top people of all kinds.
As a result of which they started adopting some of the ideas that had up to that point been very much in the sort of the boutique electronic studio.
Slowly, people's soundscape was expanding. First of all, through feedback of Jimi Hendrix. Suddenly, people realized, hey, this is a new way of experiencing sound, and, you know, bands that we're into, like the Pink Floyd doing it. And it sort of crept up. The sound of the Pink Floyd is always associated in my mind with the EMS synthesizers, the VCS3s.
Much faster than a human could ever play it. They got this new, very innovative sound.
And this sort of track is sort of bubbling along. You hear the EMS 256 sequencer. It engenders a feeling of paranoia, technology out of control. EMS equipment had enormous impact for musicians who really knew electronic music. Kraftwerk, famous German band, bought EMS gear. Tangerine Dream. Tonto's Expanding Headband bought EMS gear for use with Stevie Wonder. But many other bands, Brian Eno bought his first synthesizer, it was a VCS3. And that's one of the great sounds of early Roxy music, is Brian Eno's synthesizer. People didn't know what to call the early operators of synthesizers. Were they engineers or were they musicians? Or were they, on some albums, if you look, they're described as madcap scientists. Nobody knows what to call these folk because it's a new instrument.
By now, I'm a bit out of my depth. I'm no businessman, and I was beginning to feel the whole thing was getting out of hand. What am I supposed to be? Am I a composer or what? And I didn't get out of it all until the early 70s when I came to Australia. I looked at my life and I said, what are you going to do about your concert music? Where are your symphonies? Where are your string quartets?
When EMS was at its height, we were at the very front of technology, really not just in electronic music, but of all technology. But our studio had never had any support from the government whatsoever. And it seems such a shame looking back on it that we were foremost in the world, and yet in the end became famous for rather pathetic little synthesizers.
Thinking of the demise of the EMS company, there were many factors that led to it folding. One of them was that Peter's marriage to Victoria broke up, and she was an important benefactor to the company. It's either Peter or Tristram wrote a letter to the Times offering the studio to the nation. It was worth quite a lot of money by this point. Maybe electronic music wasn't well enough understood in Britain. No one took up his offer. And so, sadly, when the EMS went bankrupt and Peter then became really strapped for cash, the equipment was stored, I think, at the National Theatre in what Peter told me was a dungeon. I guess it was just a basement. And it had flooded.
It had been chopped to pieces with wire cutters and saws, and there was a leak and rain was pouring on it. It was heartrending.
Think ahead just 50 years, perhaps, to the day when everyone will appreciate the nuances of electronic music.
Peter's computer at EMS only had about 20K of memory. The average laptop these days is vastly more powerful. Music technology has been democratized.
It's true that every home has a very powerful computer, many millions of times more powerful than the computers which we had. Anybody can make electronic music now. It is used I think that what we can do now with computers is to start again with exactly the same aims that EMS had, which is this. Let me put it in a sentence. It's to be able to analyze a sound, put it into sensible musical form on a computer, to be able to manipulate that form and recreate it in a musical way. And that is just now, I wish I could find somebody to work with.
Every sound out of it is crazy. It's the only thing that I use to make strange science fiction noises. It's forever an inventing synth, and it kind of tells you what it wants to do, really. And then before I know it, the original bass sound I wanted and created to begin with is gone, and I've come up with this kind of new sound.